In the quiet town of Cedar Hollow, nestled between towering pines and the whispering winds of the Appalachian Mountains, lived a man named Henry Foster. He was known throughout the town not for any grand achievement, but for the silence he carried with him, a kind of heavy solitude that spoke louder than words. His life had been scarred by a past full of broken dreams, lost love, and regret. A man of 52, Henry was often mistaken for someone older, his gray-streaked hair and worn face telling the story of a life that had weathered many storms. Henry used to be different. Years ago, he was full of life, ambition, and hope. In his 20s, he had dreamed of being a writer, filling notebooks with poems and short stories. He'd fallen in love, passionately and deeply, with a woman named Clara. She was his muse, his reason to believe that love could be eternal. Together, they had painted pictures of a future where their dreams intertwined, where art and love would guide their path, but life, as it often does, had other plans. Clara was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and within 2 short years, she was gone. Her absence left a void so deep within Henry that he couldn't bring himself to write again. The dreams of their shared future evaporated, and in their place grew an overwhelming sense of failure and loss. He withdrew from his friends and family, unable to cope with the pain. He buried his notebooks in the attic, stopped going to literary circles, and eventually, found himself working at a hardware store, just something to pass the time, to fill the days that seemed endless without purpose. One evening, after another lonely day of work, Henry walked past a small café he had never noticed before. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Damaged souls still have worth." Curious, he stepped inside. The café was small, dimly lit, with mismatched furniture that gave it a cozy but somewhat disheveled feel. The walls were adorned with art, abstract pieces of broken glass arranged into beautiful mosaics. There was something poignant about the space, a sense of quiet acceptance. Behind the counter stood a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, with short cropped hair and a wide, welcoming smile. "Evening," she greeted him warmly. "What can I get you?" "Just a coffee," Henry muttered. His eyes wandering to the artwork. "First time here, huh?" she asked, preparing the drink. "We're not just a cafe. This place is a bit of a sanctuary for folks who've been through something. I started it after losing my son a few years back." Henry looked at her, surprised by her openness. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said quietly. She handed him the coffee. "Thanks. But you know, even the broken pieces have value. Sometimes it's just about finding the right way to put them back together." Henry nodded, unsure of how to respond. He took his coffee and found a seat in the corner, next to a small bookshelf filled with worn-out novels and journals. He flipped through one of them absent-mindedly. But his mind was elsewhere, on Clara, on the life he had lost, and on the sign that had drawn him in. Over the next few weeks, Henry found himself returning to the café more often. Each time, he'd sit in that same corner, sometimes reading, other times simply staring out of the window. He didn't talk much, but the atmosphere of the café, and the people who came through its doors, gave him a strange sense of comfort. One evening, the café hosted an open mic night. It was a low-key event, with locals sharing poems, songs, and stories. Henry, as usual, sat in his corner, listening but detached. As the evening wore on, the woman who ran the café, whose name he had learned was Sarah, approached him with a gentle smile. "Why don't you share something?" she asked softly. "I see you always reading those journals. You must have some words of your own to offer." Henry shook his head quickly. "No, I'm just here to listen. Come on," she urged. "This place is for people like us. People with stories, with scars. You don't have to be perfect. Just honest." For a long moment, Henry hesitated. His heart raced. And his hands felt clammy. It had been so many years since he had even thought about writing, let alone sharing anything with others. But there was something in Sarah's eyes, a kindness, a quiet understanding, that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could. With shaky hands, he pulled a crumpled notebook from his jacket pocket. It was one he had started after Clara's death but never finished. The pages were filled with raw, unfinished poems and fragmented thoughts, but he hadn't touched it in years. As he stood at the microphone, the room grew silent, all eyes on him. He cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. I wrote this a long time ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about someone I lost. I haven't read it to anyone before. He took a deep breath and began to read. His voice faltered at first, but as the words flowed, something within him stirred. The poem was about Clara, about the way her laughter had once filled their tiny apartment, the way her smile had lit up even the darkest days of her illness. It was about his grief, his regret, and the overwhelming sense of emptiness that had consumed him after she was gone. When he finished, the room was quiet. But it wasn't the kind of silence that weighed him down, it was a silence filled with understanding, with empathy. For the first time in years, Henry didn't feel alone in his pain. As he returned to his seat, Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that," she said softly. "It takes courage to be vulnerable. Remember, even the broken pieces can create something beautiful." That night, as Henry walked home, something had shifted inside him. The weight of his past was still there, but it felt lighter somehow, as if sharing his story had begun to mend a part of him that he thought was beyond repair. Over the months that followed, Henry continued to visit the café, not just as a listener but as a participant. He began writing again, filling notebook after notebook with poems, stories, and reflections on his grief, his memories of Clara, and his journey toward healing. Each time he read, the weight lifted a little more. The café became a place of renewal for Henry, a reminder that no matter how damaged a soul might be, it still had worth. His life had been fractured, but like the mosaics on the walls, those broken pieces could be rearranged into something new, something meaningful. Henry realized that his worth hadn't disappeared with his pain, it had simply been waiting to be rediscovered.